Hello, everyone. My name is Carrie Alexander, and for my final project, I will be doing a presentation on KRACK, WPA2's dangerous flaw, which is currently infiltrating the wireless world. So, when you connect or set up a wireless network using your computer or your mobile device, you almost instinctively select WPA2. There's typically a list of options for the security protocol, but by instinct or by instruction by someone else, you select WPA2 these days. But what actually happens when you make this selection? As simply put as possible, there's a handshake, a four-way handshake to be exact. And this handshake occurs as a part of WPA2's cryptographic protocols, which encrypt the data that is being transmitted over Wi-Fi or over your wireless connection. This security protocol helps to defend against things such as eavesdropping or other sort of attacks that might be implemented on wireless networks. Now, however, there's actually been a recent discovery which has revealed that WPA2's protocol has been breached for successful eavesdropping and even data manipulation. The preliminary attack that revealed the vulnerability is what is called KRACK, so the focus of my presentation. And KRACK is actually an acronym that stands for Key Reinstallation Attacks. The way it works is that it attacks the four-way handshake that I spoke about before. And this is a big issue because the way that it infiltrates the system or the wireless networks, um, it doesn't really matter how the security protocol for WPA2 was implemented because your system is still vulnerable because the protocol itself is inherently vulnerable. So regardless of how you set up the network, how you set up your security protocol or your system, it's inherently vulnerable. So, regardless, you're at risk. WPA2 has been the standard for the last 14 years or so. So now knowing that the system is dangerously flawed in this way, many of us who are wireless users or just users of the internet in general are really in need of a protocol that we can rely on and that can possibly replace WPA2. It's kind of crazy to think that something has been unbreachable almost for about 13 to 14 years, and now there's this new finding saying that we need something else. What is WPA2? Well, in order to talk about WPA2, you kind of go through the timeline or the history of different wireless security protocols to begin with. So the first is WEP, which stands for Wired Equivalent Privacy, and this was implemented back in the late 90s. Um, the second is WPA, which stands for Wi-Fi Protected Access, which was implemented in the early 2000s, 2003, 2000, early 2004 era. And then the third is the Wi-Fi Protected Access 2, which is WPA2, which is what is the current, latest security protocol. But just going through the history a little bit of the different protocols and how we got to WPA2, starting with WEP, like I said, it was implemented in the 90s. It was the most widely used security protocol for wireless networks and Wi-Fi in the world at the time. In about September of 1999, so just before 2000, uh, it was deemed the security standard just across the board. Um, and the way that this protocol is configured is that devices that were using WEP were restricted to 64-bit encryption. Later on, that encryption was increased to 128-bit keys, and then 256-bit keys were made available. However, the 128 bits remain the most commonly used implementation of WEP. In 2001, there were conceptual vulnerabilities announced about WEP. So there were concepts produced in ways on how WEP could be, vulnerable or it could be breached in a way. And then around between 2001 and 2004, there were actually applied vulnerabilities announced. And at that point, WEP was retired officially. Next, going into WPA, the Wi-Fi protected access. so the predecessor to WPA2, this was the replacement for WEP. It was supposed to replace its vulnerabilities. It was supposed to take care of all those vulnerabilities that were found in WEP, both conceptual vulnerabilities and the actual applied vulnerabilities. And in 2003, after some thorough review, WPA was formally adopted as the Wi-Fi security protocol standard. So now, WEP had officially been phased out in 2003, and now WPA was becoming what was widely used. The way that WPA was configured is that just straight from the jump, it was configured to support 256-bit keys encryption, and then it implemented a TKIP, which stands for Temporal Key Integrity Protocol, and this was to help with easy rollouts on WEP systems. So for people who maybe wanted to continue with their WEP system or WEP protocol, or they were still in the process of phasing between WEP and WPA, WPA had the capability to still work on WEP-enabled systems, which is really key for users, that might not have been keeping up with the times, so to speak. WPA, in the same regard, WPA had some recycled elements of WEP, which was part of the reason why it was able to work on WEP systems. So temporal key integrity protocol, so the TKIP, was one of those recycled elements from WEP that allowed WPA to be used on WEP systems. After about a few months or so, there were both conceptual and applied vulnerabilities announced that were conducted by the FBI, I believe, and one of the main vulnerabilities that was found were intrusion vulnerabilities, and then also their Wi-Fi protected setup vulnerability. So Wi-Fi protected setup, also known as WPS, was a vulnerability with WEP. It was a major vulnerability because WPS is what linked devices to modern access points. So access points that people use to gain access to internet or Wi-Fi was possible because of this WPS system. Now that there was a vulnerability found with the WPS part of the system, WPA had to be phased out, and thus subsequently WPA2 is what came about. So about officially, studies or reports say 2004 was when WPA2 was implemented, but in the late 2003, early 2004 time frame, WPA was introduced by the Wi-Fi Alliance. It was actually created by IEEE organization, and WPA2 is actually known as, the technical term for WPA2 is IEEE 802.11i. There's a lot of information, but WPA2 is fine. So in 2006, WPA2 officially superseded WPA. So it had been phased in 2004, shortly after the vulnerabilities were found with WPA. However, it wasn't officially adopted or officially being used or officially named the standard really until 2006. And the way WPA2 was configured was that, for starters, it required more processing power, which was a big deal. So, this kind of made a way for all systems had to change. A lot of different standards and things had to change in order to support the WPA2 system because it required more processing power. Secondly, WPA2 came equipped with the Advanced Encryption Standard algorithm, or AES as we know it today. And then also it had the counter cipher mode with blockchain message authentication code protocol. So that's the CCMP, which was supposed to replace that previous talked about TKIP protocol that was implemented or that was a part of the WPA system. So not only did WPA2 require more processing power, it had a more advanced algorithm for protection, and then it came along with a replacement for the TKIP that was in the WPA as well as the WEP system. So basically, everything was pretty much made better and more secure and better equipped to handle vulnerabilities and different types of possible attacks and things. However, WPS, which was still a part of the WPA2 system, was still somewhat of a liability, but you could disable it. So even today, some systems or some networks might have the option for WPS, and you can either enable or disable it. And the advisement is that you disable it because it is a liability. What is KRACK exactly? So like I said before, KRACK stands for key reinstallation attacks. So the K is for key, R is for reinstallation, and then the ACK is for the attack part of the name of the vulnerability. So KRACK was discovered by two security researchers at KU Leuven, which is in Belgium, Matthew Van Hoof and Frank Pearsons. They were the two researchers who discovered the vulnerability and made that information available through a very thorough and in-depth paper on some research and tests that they did on the vulnerability, or really just tests that they were doing on the WPA2 system. They were able to figure out that basically data and information over the wireless networks using WPA2 were vulnerable and could be manipulated. So the threat agents in this case, for just going with some of the concepts that we learned in our course, the threat agents would be data thieves and forgers, which is a big part of how the vulnerability is used. And then the assets would be the wireless network itself and Wi-Fi enabled devices that use WPA2. So the vulnerability that KRACK targets is that WPA2 four-way handshake that I mentioned before. That four-way handshake is important because it authenticates the connection between the users and the access points where they are able to pull their Wi-Fi in from. The way that attackers actually utilize KRACK is that, well, first off, there's a bit of a limitation on an attacker's ability to utilize KRACK. One, because that attacker actually has to be within physical range of the targeted network or the targeted Wi-Fi that they're trying to infiltrate. That is one of the keys for an attacker who might be trying to take advantage of this vulnerability with WPA2. But anyway, the way that an attacker can infiltrate the WPA2 vulnerability is the attacker will typically try to attack, or like I said before, infiltrate the third communication, which is a part of the four-way handshake. So this kind of speaks to the implicit or the inherent vulnerability within WPA2. The issue is that third point of communication in the four-way handshake is where the vulnerability lies. So like I said before, regardless of how the protocol was implemented or what have you, it's still vulnerable. Regardless of how you set up your encryption or just the protocol itself for your system, or even for a small business or whoever as an everyday user, it's still vulnerable because the issue is with the protocol itself. It's not with how it's being set up. As a part of this attack on this third communication and the four-way handshake, one of the key parts of exploiting this vulnerability is the nonce reuse. A second key part is their reinstallations. That the way attackers go about it is that they reinstall cryptographic keys that have already been used. So a cryptographic key that might have been used for someone to connect to the network, an attacker is able to basically almost clone that essentially and use it again, even though it's already been used. Right now, there isn't some sort of detection mechanism to detect if a key has already been used. If you can manipulate it, you can reuse it. And then the third thing is that attackers reset transmitted data packet counts, which manipulates a contingency built into WPA2's handshake. So these three things are the major components on how an attacker can use the KRACK vulnerability to gain access to data and information being transmitted over a wireless connection or Wi-Fi network that is set up using WPA2. So how does KRACK affect the wireless world? Well, if it isn't already evident, um, it affects wireless devices immediately. Subsequently, it also affects information. So, quote by Matthew Van Hoof, one of the researchers who discovered KRACK, and he was quoted in an article by Wired stating that if your device supports Wi-Fi, it is most likely affected. And based on their research and information that they gathered, this has been proven to be true. This just kind of goes back to that implicit vulnerability within WPA2 that you can't really do much of anything about because it's not about how you set up the system or how you went about setting up your system. Pretty much no matter what, it's vulnerable, it's an issue. Um, Going back to these effects that KRACK has on the wireless world, so wireless devices, pretty much any Wi-Fi enabled device is affected. For example, Android 6.0 and Linux have been two of the most talked about um, systems that have been infected that are at risk. These two have kind of been at the forefront of any of the research or any of the findings about the vulnerability. Secondly, any correct implementation of WPA2 is affected. Like I stated before, it's just that inherent vulnerability built into the system that, if an attacker knows about it or knows how to manipulate the parts of the handshake for WPA2, they can gain access to a machine or a device and pretty much have their way with it, so to speak. And then lastly, vendors have to reinforce security. So pretty much any vendor that produces machines or devices or modems or routers or what have you that you're setting up your wireless networks on and things like that, there's going to need security reinforcement in this regard because it is such a vast issue and it does affect the wireless world on a large scale. Like, this isn't a small problem. Like I said before, WPA2 has been the standard for 14 years. And now there's this vulnerability found that just kind of makes it all crumble all at once. As far as information goes, though, with this new vulnerability, the pyramid or the CIA pyramid that you kind of learn about with information assurance or information security, and that we've talked about in this class, confidentiality gets exploited, integrity gets exploited, as well as availability. So if your system's infiltrated, that information is at risk. The confidentiality and the integrity of your information is at risk. You don't know who's getting access to your data. You don't know what's happening to that data. So the data can be manipulated. The data can be infiltrated, and you wouldn't know. As far as availability, this causes an issue for systems because it makes systems unavailable. It makes them unusable. So this is a pretty big issue. That's why it's such a hot topic in the wireless world right now, or just dealing with information security in general. Second effect on information is data infiltration. Like I said before, it just kind of goes back to the confidentiality aspect of wireless transmissions. So data infiltration, you got data manipulation, data forgery, and eavesdropping. All of these things are kind of ripple effects of such a large and critical vulnerabilities like KRACK, because it does kind of dismantle the whole pyramid of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So now that we know a little bit more about the issue, well, what can be done about the issue? So some of the countermeasures done based on articles, based on other investigative research done on KRACK and its effects, and how it can be used, uh, how it can be used, not necessarily that it has been used. So far, there haven't necessarily been any major stories or anything that I've seen in my research or that I've seen from other researchers that state that the vulnerability has been exploited. But I mean, it's been exposed for a few months now, since about, I think, the end of October, KRACK has been exposed as a vulnerability in WPA2. So I wouldn't be surprised if by now, attackers and users who might want to manipulate and exploit this vulnerability are starting to make efforts to try and do so. So while there hasn't been any documented successful exploitations of the vulnerability, these things that I've talked about in my presentation are like the issues with it. And maybe it is a good thing that, there hasn't been any documented successful attempts at exploiting KRACK, because I think it kind of gives security professionals maybe a little bit more time to kind of work around the issue and figure out what the issue is and potentially find a replacement or some type of countermeasure that maybe can assist people using WPA2, or just those of us who are everyday users on wireless networks who might be infected and not know that we're affected. But anyway, moving forward, some of the countermeasures, just based on the research that has been done on KRACK thus far, is implementing antivirus. That's one of the first things that you should do when you get a wireless device in the first place, especially a computer. Implement antivirus, because you don't know what's on your system. You don't know what's coming into your system. And now that we have this vulnerability, you don't know what might be accessing your system without your knowledge. For example, what I use is I like to use Symantec's antivirus software known as Norton. I have the Norton 1, which I think is like their latest right now, which is supposed to be top of the line. So antivirus software, some computers come with it already built in, which is good. You have things like McAfee as well. If that floats your boat, that floats your boat. I go with Norton right now. Symantec is actually one of the researchers that did a lot of, they're one of the sources that did a lot of research and background on the KRACK vulnerability. And I believe they're providing antivirus software for users even more now than ever, especially because of this vulnerability with KRACK. So, if you're hearing this presentation and you didn't know anything about this and now you're concerned, I would tell you not to be overly concerned, but to definitely maybe take some of these countermeasures that are in this presentation. So antivirus first and foremost. Secondly, software updates. Definitely got to stay up to date with your software. I know with different devices and things like that, and even computers, people don't like the updates because it changes the way stuff looks, or they don't like the change in the usability. But it's very important to keep your software most up to date so that it's compatible with things such as security updates, which is the next thing on this list. Security updates are critical and very important so that you can have the most advanced and most up to date security protocols on your devices securing your system. You don't want to be left behind just because you might not like something, or even if you're not technically savvy, just set your computer or your device to automatically update. Then you don't even have to worry about it. Automatically update the software, automatically update the security. But those two things outside of antivirus software would definitely be extremely important in combating or taking the necessary countermeasures or precautions against KRACK. Fourth on the list is installing reputable VPN. So people that might be using VPNs at their job, or even companies that use VPNs, should definitely install a reputable VPN prior to connecting to your Wi-Fi connection. This allows that extra layer of security. Like, these are all different layers to security that kind of back up one another. So it's not just one thing that'll be a countermeasure that'll suffice. It's typically multiple things that you need to do, and these things on this list are all those different layers of security. So installing reputable VPN prior to Wi-Fi connection is very, very important. Next would be to only use HTTPS enabled websites. So if you're online or on the internet and you're on a website, some people notice, some people don't, but typically in the corner before the website, it'll say HTTP or HTTPS. Based on some of the research done, HTTPS is the best way to go. That S, it stands for secure or security. So it means it's that website has been secured and has been approved for use. So these are just some of the preliminary countermeasures that should be taken to, prevent against KRACK taking advantage of vulnerabilities in the WPA2 system, but also to prevent, against the possibility that your system might have been infiltrated or might possibly be infiltrated in the future. Sticking with countermeasures a little bit longer, there are some more in-depth approaches. So in the last slide, they were more of the preliminary approaches that everyday users can take, or everyday business owners, small, medium businesses, or what have you, can take to sort of defend against this vulnerability, defend against KRACK. Excuse me. But some of the more in-depth approaches that it might take a little bit more technical knowledge, or it might require you to bring in a professional. Data confidentiality protocol. So this goes back to one of the issues with the vulnerability, with the KRACK vulnerability. The attackers that I was talking about before are able to manipulate that third communication in the four-way handshake, and the way that works is because they're able to manipulate that, they can continuously use already installed cryptographic keys. So this has to do with the data confidentiality protocol that is built into WPA2. So already in use keys are able to be reinstalled as if like they weren't installed before. Like I said before, there's no really detection portion in WPA2 to detect if keys have already been used, to detect if things are being cloned, to detect if things are being manipulated. So this is a major issue with the vulnerability. So like I said, this is a more in-depth approach to taking the necessary countermeasures against KRACK. But data confidentiality protocol is a major part of why WPA2 is inherently vulnerable. Then one of the other keys in as far as countermeasures go is ensuring that the key counter only counts up. So when you install those keys, it counts those keys. So before, with the already in use keys being installed, the best countermeasure would be to implement some way for the security protocol to check for already in use keys being installed, once again, being cloned, being reused, being manipulated. So there needs to be provisions for detecting those keys being reinstalled, but there also needs to be provisions that subsequently count the keys. So if it can be ensured that the key counter only counts up, then there wouldn't be as many issues, because the key counter is able to be manipulated as well, in addition to the keys that have already been installed. So the key counter, ensuring that the key counter only counts up is another way to maintain and sort of solidify and resecure the data confidentiality protocol within the system. A second more in-depth countermeasure is regarding the four-way handshake as well. Pretty much kind of going back to that data confidentiality protocol portion, this just kind of goes back to the key reinstallation as well, because that's really the foundation for this KRACK vulnerability, is that it is able to reinstall keys. So if security professionals or what have you or maybe even the people who found out about the vulnerability with KRACK can find a way to assure that a key is only installed once into the system, then that'll already provide one layer of more in-depth provision in terms of security. So with the data confidentiality protocol, there's a key that gets installed into that protocol as well. So there are multiple different keys. It's kind of very technical to explain, but with the data confidentiality protocol, there are keys that get reinstalled and get reused there, and there's a counter involved there. And if you can maintain that the counter only counts up, then that's already one step towards being better prepared against the vulnerability. Now, during the four-way handshake, though, the keys that are getting, I guess, processed within the data confidentiality protocol, they are installed within the four-way handshake. So if during the four-way handshake there can be assurance that a key is only installed once into the entity that's implementing the data confidentiality protocol, then that'll also help. So just to eliminate any confusion, so with the data confidentiality protocol, there needs to be a check for keys already being used that have already been installed. So keys that are already installed, there needs to be a check to make sure that they're not being reused. Keys are not being reused. Secondly, things need to be ensured that the counter is counting up, because that count can be manipulated as it stands right now. So if the counter is counting up, you can check for already in use keys being reinstalled. That'll kind of flash that red light to kind of stop the attacker or whoever's trying to manipulate the keys. Now, following that with the four-way handshake, there needs to be assurance that a key is only installed once into the entity that implements that data confidentiality protocol. So there's an entity that implements the data confidentiality protocol that has keys that it needs as well. So there needs to be assurance that the keys being used with the data confidentiality protocol are not being manipulated, and then subsequently the entity that implements the data confidentiality protocol, there needs to be assurance that those keys are only installed once. So those are two of the more in-depth countermeasures. It's a very technical part of the breakdown of how KRACK works, but those are things that kind of are more at a advanced level for someone who is like a security professional or someone who works in security assurance as their profession. In conclusion, we understand that KRACK makes WPA2 breakable. WPA2 has been the leading protocol for 13 to 14 years now, and now we're finding out that it is breakable, and that what makes it breakable is actually inherent. It's not an implementation issue. It's an issue with the protocol itself. So that kind of drops the question of, is accessing the internet, is Wi-Fi safe, as well as are Wi-Fi devices usable, because this definitely affects those things. Users might not feel safe, even though like people have to use the internet. We need to use the internet. We need to access information, and people are more inclined to use the internet to answer questions, to get information, to gather research. So there's going to be a big deal as far as like the internet safety and Wi-Fi safety. So definitely, stay alert, stay aware of different things that are happening in the wireless world, or even with your own wireless setup at home or at work or what have you. But secondly, keep an eye on your devices. The usability of the device can be affected by this vulnerability. Like I said before, you have Android and Linux devices and software that are kind of at the forefront of things being manipulated or things being exploited via KRACK. Next is patches. So just typically when there's a vulnerability or something just discovered, the organization or the company that built whatever device or software where the vulnerability is found typically releases security patches. So WPA2 was created by IEEE. So I guess the question is, is IEEE going to produce some patches to sort of circumvent the issue or try to resolve the issue? I don't know. There hasn't been any substantial research stating that they will. Based on the research that I've done, based on the research that I've seen, are there patches to come? Kind of that whole now what type of mentality. So like, now what do we know? There's an issue. We know there's an issue. We know how it's being exploited. We know what countermeasures can be taken, but what are the people who are responsible for this going to do? So I would say be on the lookout for patches potentially to come. Maybe patches won't come. Now, if patches don't come, I would anticipate, even if patches do come, I would still anticipate there being a replacement for WPA2. It's just kind of the cycle of life and what we saw leading up to WPA2. You know, there was an issue with WEP, there was a vulnerability found, then there was an upgrade to WPA, then the same thing happened. There was an issue, there was a vulnerability found with WPA, and then the upgrade to WPA2. Now, WPA2 has lasted the longest out of those three protocols in terms of the history of Wi-Fi security and Wi-Fi security protocols. So, you know, who knows, maybe there is a replacement already in the works, already on its way. But, you know, I would anticipate there being some new security standard or a new replacement to come out, just following suit with, you know, what's been done in the past, and just the trend of the way things have worked with Wi-Fi security protocols, and kind of trying to rebut those vulnerabilities and exploitations.